Hey guys, Miss Fearon here. Welcome to Unit 4 Notes 2. We're going to start factoring trinomials today. So our learning target, or what you should know before we get to the end of the video or understand by the end of the video, is factoring a trinomial. So to factor trinomials, we're going to go ahead and use factor by grouping as one of our pieces. So this is what we did yesterday. So I just want to bring your brain back into it. Step 1, remember, is we draw in our parentheses, and then we look for the GCF of each set. So for the first one, I know that the number they have in common is going to be a 6, and that they both also have an x. So that's my GCF I'm going to take out of that one. The second set of parentheses, I know that the only number they have in common is a 1. But here's the trick, and if you talked with me at all about this yesterday, if this is a minus here, then these means I need to take out a negative 1, or that number that I take out, that GCF, has to be a negative. So now I write my GCF of the first set multiplied by what is left when I do the division. So 18 divided by 6 gives me 3. X squared divided by x gives me x. I have a minus. 30 divided by 6 gives me 5. X divided by x, those cancel each other out. So now that negative 1 is what I'm taking out. And when I do 3x divided by negative 1, I end up getting a 3x. And now careful, the reason is that I did that is this is actually a negative 3x. So that's why a negative divided by a negative gives me that positive. And then a positive 5 divided by a negative 1 gives me a negative 5. So the inside parentheses match, 3x minus 5, that's good. And then the GCFs are my second set, so a 6x minus 1. If that subtraction or that negative number can't confuse you at all, come chat with me before moving forward for today's notes. So here's our steps for factoring trinomials. Step 1, we're going to always check for a GCF first. We're going to think, what number do all of those things have in common? If there's anything, then I'm going to take that out first before moving on to the next steps. Step 2, tell me I multiply a times c. After I multiply a times c, that's going to go on the top of our x that we're going to create. And then that middle term, the b, is going to go on the bottom. So remember, the a is with the x squared, b is with the x, and c is the constant. We're then going to find the two numbers that multiply to the top of the x and add to the bottom. We're going to split the b term into those two factors that we found. And then we're going to do what we did yesterday and factor by grouping. So let's try to make this all make sense and look at an example. Number 1, the first thing we want to do is we want to see, do they have a GCF that we can take out? Do they have a number or a variable in common that can come out right away? So I have a 5, a 13, and a 6. They all do not have a number in common. And they all do not have a variable in common. So there is no GCF I'm going to start with in the beginning. So I'm going to move straight to the x. I'm going to create my x. Remember, we do a times c to get the top of that. So 5 times 6 gives me 30. And then the b value is going to go to the bottom. So what that means is I am looking for two numbers that multiply to 30 and add to 13. So I know that 10 and 3 are going to do it. But if you couldn't figure that out, remember, you can always create your factor tree. I'd have 1 and 30. 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. So the only ones that worked were that 3 and that 10. So I'm going to rewrite the a x squared. That's going to stay. But the b term is going to be rewritten as the two factors that I found. So I'm going to have 10x plus 3x. And then I'm still going to have the c term from above, so plus 6. So now I'm going to factor by grouping just like I did yesterday. Set up my two sets of parentheses. Divide out the GCF. Well, my first set, they both have a 5x in common. My second set, they both have a 3 in common. So I'm going to have 5x times 5x squared divided by 5x gives me x. And a 10x divided by 5x gives me 2. 3x divided by 3 gives me x. 6 divided by 3 gives me 2. So I am left with x plus 2, 5x plus 3. And I did not take a GCF out right away in the beginning, so this would be my final answer. I'm in factored form. I'm good to go. So example number 2, we're going to do the same process. We're going to say, do they have a GCF in common that we can take out right away? I have 7, 29, and 4. There is no number they have in common, and they also all don't have a variable in common. So we're going to move straight to completing our x. So I'm going to do a times c to get to the top. So 7 times 4 gives me 28. And then the b term is going to go on the bottom, so 29. So I'm looking for the numbers that multiply to 28 and add to 29. So I have 1 and 28, 2 and 14. 3 does not go into 28. I have 4 and 7. 5 doesn't go in, 6 doesn't go in, and I round it around. So the numbers that multiply to 28 but add to that 29 I need are the 1 and the 28. So I'm going to do 1 and 28. So now I'm going to rewrite my expression with 7x squared. The ax squared stays. The bx gets rewritten as the two factors I found for my x, so 1x plus 28x. And then the c will stay from the original problem. And now I can factor by grouping again. So I'm going to say, well, what does 7x squared and 1x have in common? They both have a 1x. And then a 28x and a 4. They both have a 4. So I am going to have 1x times 7x squared divided by 1x gives me 7x. A 1x divided by a 1x gives me plus 1. I have the GCF I took out of the second, which was 4. 28 divided by 4, it gives me 7, and I still have that x. And then 4 divided by 4 gives me 1. So I have 7x plus 1 and 1x plus 4. They don't have a GCF in common, so that's going to be my answer. I'm done. All right, let's look at example number 3 here. So again, we're going to go ahead and we are going to say, what is it that they all have in common? Is there a GCF right away in the beginning I can take out? This one does not have a GCF, so I'm going to go straight to my x. So I'm multiplying to a times c to get to the top. Well, 1 times 16 is 16. And I want to add to the b term. That is a minus 10 or a negative 10 in my x. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to 16 and add to negative 10. So I get a 1 and a 16, 2 and 8, 3 doesn't go into 16, 4 and 4. So I need this to be a negative 10 when I add them. That means that if I make this 2 and 8 negative, if I add a negative 2 and a negative 8, I get a negative 10. And when I multiply a negative times a negative, I still get that positive that I wanted. So I'm actually going to use negative 2 and negative 8. So I'm going to rewrite. The ax squared is going to stay. The bx is going to be split into the two factors I just found, so negative 2x minus 8x. And then the c stays from the original problem. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. So the first set of parentheses, they both only have an x in common, so I'm going to take that out of there. And then my second set of parentheses, they both have a negative 8 in common. Remember, since this is a negative, I need this number to be a negative. So I have x. What would be left would be an x minus 2. And then I'm taking a negative 8 out, so I'd be left with an x minus 2 again. So I'd have x minus 2, x minus 8. I didn't take a GCF out right away in the beginning, so that's my final answer, and I'm good to go. Go ahead and pause the video. I want you to try number 4. Keep in mind that this is a negative 18 and this is a negative 7. So when you get to that x, you're looking for something that multiplies to the negative 18 and adds to a negative 7. So I found my two factors to be a negative 9 and 2. When I multiply that, I get a negative on the top, a negative 18, and then when I add a negative 9 plus 2, I get a negative 7. So when you rewrite and factor by grouping, you should have ended up with x minus 9, x plus 2. If you got anything different than that, please come check in with me before moving forward. So our next example here, remember, we want to see, do they have a GCF in common that we can take out right away in the beginning? A 3, an 11, and a negative 4. Those do not have any number in common that I can take out other than the 1. So I'm going to jump straight into creating the x. Remember, it's a times c to get to the top. So 3 times negative 4 gives me negative 12. And then your b term goes into the bottom, so the 11. So then I'm looking for factors that multiply to negative 12 and add to 11. So I always look for my factors of the positive number first. So I have 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So numbers that are going to add to an 11, if I make this a negative 1, 12 plus a negative 1 add to 11 and multiply to the negative 12 that I want. So I'm going to have a negative 1 and a 12. And I'm going to rewrite. So I have my ax squared that stays from the beginning. The bx is going to be the 2 new factors that I rewrote in the x. And then the c stays from the beginning. So now I can factor by grouping. So a 3x squared and a 1x, they both have an x in common. And a 12x and a 4, they both have a 4 in common. So I'm going to write the x that I took out. 3x squared divided by x gives me 3x. A negative 1x divided by x gives me the negative 1. Plus 4 is the GCF I took out of the second. 12x divided by 4 gives me 3x. Negative 4 divided by 4 gives me negative 1. So I get 3x minus 1, x plus 4. I did not take a GCF out right away in the beginning, so I'm done with that one. Again, try number 6 on your own. Think, go through your steps. Do they have a GCF in common right away first? If not, set up your x and then factor by grouping. Pause the video, try it, come back and check your work. So I ended up with x plus 1 times x plus 2. If you got anything different, please come chat with me before moving on with the video. So this next box here is just kind of a review of what we already talked about. When we are